Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm Peter Schmitz, and our theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. I want to return to the subject of Philadelphia opera this time, which we touched upon when discussing the playwright Albert Innamorato, but we haven't really looked at performances of actual operas. And not since we left Oscar Hammerstein behind when he was forced to give up on his magnificent new opera house on North Broad Street back in 1910. After all, opera is a theatrical form, one that often caters to a certain elite audience and a wealthy crowd, admittedly. But if we can explore the more populist and earthy elements of burlesque at the Trocadero Theater, as we did last time, surely we can also spend some time with the swells and the aesthetes at the city's opera halls. This also gives me a chance to share with you 3 stories that I've come across in the archives of Philadelphia Opera. The first one is about the old National Theater on 9th and Chestnut, and it dates from the 1840s. The second one is from 1911, from that period just after Oscar Hammerstein had left Philadelphia behind, and his previous opera company was continuing as the Chicago-Philadelphia Opera. And the third piece is one that I found in the microfilm records of the Evening Bulletin while looking for stories about the opening night of the musical Kiss Me, Kate. So that story takes place just about the time when Cole Porter's musical was playing next door at the Schubert Theater. But before we visit the 1940s, let's go all the way back to the 1840s, an era when Philadelphia was one of the leading cities for operatic performance in the United States. Okay, so this first one I'm going to read is from a book called Stage Reminiscences, being recollections, chiefly personal, of celebrated theatrical and musical performers during the last 40 years by an old stagehand. It's a work by an author named Matthew Mackintosh and was published in Glasgow, Scotland in 1866. Now, although much of this book takes place in London, what caught my eye about it is that the author claims to have spent a great deal of the 1840s in the United States, especially in Philadelphia. So I'm going to read a chapter entitled Braham in America. It centers on the English tenor John Braham, a completely forgotten figure today, but quite well known in his day. Braham was also remarkable for being one of the first Jewish opera stars in Europe. The chapter also mentions a famous Scottish soprano, Elizabeth Everarity, and our old friend Charlotte Cushman, who, you may remember, once had an ambition to be an opera singer herself. The work in question is one of the most popular English language operas of that day, Guy Mannering, by Henry Bishop, based on the novel by Sir Walter Scott. A little over a quarter of a century ago, I witnessed the first appearance on the American stage of John Braham, the world-renowned English tenor. It was on the boards of the National Theatre in Philadelphia, to which I was at the time attached as a machinist. The said theatre, I may mention by the way, was originally a circus, having been erected as such by Mr. Cook, the well-known equestrian proprietor. It was built for him by his relative, Mr. Barlow, father of Mr. T.C. Barlow, pyrotechnist in Glasgow, and I had the task of converting it from an arena for the display of horsemanship into a temple of the legitimate drama. The lessee and manager at the time was Mr. W.E. Burton, formerly a capital comedian at the Haymarket Theatre in London. But to return to Mr. Braham's first appearance, it was on the 4th of May, 1840, and the piece was the operatic play of Guy Mannering. Braham, of course, playing the part of Henry Bertram. Those who know the piece, and what playgoer doesn't, will remember that the hero makes his first appearance in the second act, the scene being a lady's boudoir, with large French windows opening to a garden and a lake behind, on the latter of which she's supposed to be in a boat, serenading his lady love on the flute. Then the echo duet is sung by the pair, the gentleman remaining out of sight of the audience until just at its close. On this occasion, I was behind with Braham, preparing to work the boat, when it occurred to me that instead of singing his part in the duet from the extreme back of the stage, as is usual, it would give him a better chance with the audience to sing it from the prompt entrance. American stages, I may mention, like American lakes, rivers, and waterfalls, are very much larger than their old world representatives, and by the arrangement I thought of, the vocalist would be full 50 feet nearer those who were to hear him. Having been an employee of his at the St. James Theatre for some time, I knew him well enough to take the liberty of suggesting my idea to him. He at once cheerfully adopted. He sung his part splendidly, standing alongside the prompter, and such was the enthusiasm it created that the duet had to be twice repeated. The moment he had sung his last note, Braham darted around behind and got into the boat, which then glided on in view of the house, and the English tenor par excellence stepped out of it onto the stage. His reception was mortifying to him in the extreme. The audience had heard a voice, which, naturally enough, they associated with the figure and bearing of an Apollo. So when the little Jew came forward, the revulsion of feeling was such that a distinct titter of disappointment ran through the house, and not a hand of applause was given to welcome the greatest tenor that Britain has ever produced. Braham had a good head and body, but his legs were short, his feet large, and he shuffled in his gait, worse, I think, than any other man that ever trod the boards of a theatre. To make matters worse for the little man, it so happened that the Julia Mannering of the evening was Miss J. Inverarity, a handsome, strapping Scotch lassie, then about 20 years of age, and 5 feet 10 inches high, as Braham's height was but 5 feet and 1 inch. The contrast between Henry Bertram and his Julia was certainly striking, and much to the disadvantage of the gentleman. The business of the scene was gone through quietly, but Braham was so overcome with disappointment that he was incapable of singing the fine song of bishops which belongs to this scene. And when he came off the stage, big tears were rolling down his furrowed cheeks. Well, thank you for letting me use my Scott accent, or my approximation of it. Let me tell you, as soon as I started looking into the details of this chapter, it became clear to me that right after at least the opening section about the building of the National Theatre on Chestnut Street, all correct and proper, the rest of it was all lies. In fact, that whole story was almost a complete fabrication. The dates and the names in it just don't match the records, not in any Philadelphia newspaper of the day. John Braham never sang with Elizabeth Inverary. He was not in Philadelphia in May 1840. The National Theatre did not stage Guy Mannering in May, though it did later that year. And then the author's subsequent assertion about the presence of the actress Charlotte Cushman in the company as well is incorrect. By this point in her life, Cushman had given up her singing career entirely. Stage Reminiscences is a most unreliable memoir, I must say, with a touch of garden variety anti-Semitism to boot. Later on, he makes himself the hero of the story, sending Braham back on stage to sing his song one more time, this time to cheers, in which the Philadelphia audience actually jumps onto the stage to put laurels directly on the tenor's head. Well, in fact, looking through all the other chapters of the book, it really seems it should more properly be termed a work of theatrical fantasy. Turns out that there never really was anybody named Matthew McIntosh. It's just a pen name. So, a good reminder to us all as students of history to check both the prejudices and the reliability of our sources. The second opera story I have for you, thank goodness, is much more verifiable. This is about the history of an opera called Natoma. The date was February 25th, 1911, and the opera Natoma, a very serious work by the popular composer Victor Herbert, better known, of course, for his light comic operettas, had its world premiere performance at the former Philadelphia Opera House, made by impresario Oscar Hammerstein, now known as the Metropolitan Opera House on North Broad Street. 3 days later, the opera was scheduled to be repeated, this time at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, the old one on 39th Street and Broadway. Now, this premiere event was met with much anticipation by all American opera lovers because this was going to be the first great American opera, it was said, performed with an English-language libretto by California lawyer and songwriter Joseph D. Redding, an opera that, unlike all the Carmens and Zauberflötes and Cavalleria Rusticanas and Toscas, the audience could understand. And it was also in an American setting. Natoma was one of the first great commissions by the Philadelphia-Chicago Opera Company, the newly combined troupe of Andreas Dippel in Chicago and Edward Stotesbury in Philadelphia. Essentially, this was the former Philadelphia Opera Company of Hammerstein had created in 1907, but had been forced to sell out 2 years later. The Scottish soprano Mary Garden, the leading dramatic opera diva of her day, performed the title role of the California Indian maiden Natoma. Irish tenor John McCormack sang the role of her American lover, Lieutenant John Merrill. The Mexican grandee, Don Francisco, was done by the French baritone Gustave Huberdeau, and his daughter by the American soprano Lillian Grenville. Most of the other roles were filled by various Italian and Spanish performers. The great Italian conductor Cleofanti Campanini was in the orchestra pit, and the expenditure of much effort and expense on the authentic California mission setting was impressive. In fact, what this really was, I think, was sort of a American version of Madama Butterfly, the Puccini opera that had been such a hit in 1907. So they've essentially taken the same plot from Madama Butterfly and moved it to the early California setting and having an Indian maiden girl instead of a Japanese girl. And much as Puccini did, incorporate some authentic music. Puccini incorporated Japanese music into Madama Butterfly, and Victor Herbert incorporated what he called authentic American Indian melodies into Natoma. So I'm going to read you excerpts of the account of the evening by one Charles Henry Meltzer, who was then the opera critic for the San Francisco Examiner. Mr. Meltzer, I suspect, however, was a friend of the lyricist John Redding. Now, as you can hear, Meltzer was principally excited about the mere existence of any opera with an English-language text. I mean, even Madama Butterfly or La Fanciulla del West was written in Italian, right? But it seems like he was also aware of the excitement caused by Hammerstein's old production of Salome that we reported on back in season 2. And so, this time the critic got a bit carried away by all the excitement surrounding Natoma as well. Here we go. Nothing in the history of opera in Philadelphia, not even, it is said, the attendance at the sensational production of Salome, has attracted so large an assemblage as that which filled the opera house this evening. The enthusiasm was spontaneous, wholehearted, and rapturously emphatic. It marked the deep interest entertained by Philadelphians in the case of the English Grand Opera, to which the city has now given an impetus of prime importance. A world premiere in opera, furthermore, is something which has never taken place here. The eyes of the entire artistic world of America were directed to Philadelphia this evening. The fate of Natoma is of the utmost significance in the progress of native music in this country. The attitude of tonight's huge audience would seem to have indicated nothing but success in this venture. Natoma is not a masterpiece in every detail, but unquestionably it betokens the openings of a new musical epoch. When the curtain fell down upon the first act, a torrent of applause and approval broke forth. There were 8 curtain calls for the principals, the composer, and the librettist. Miss Garden finally appeared alone and accepted a bouquet of violets and lilies thrown to her. Well, My goodness, and that was only the first act. According to his account, Garden finally escaped the recurrent demands of the Philly audience for more bows by shoving her bouquet of violets and lilies into Victor Herbert's hands and fleeing backstage to prepare. Because remember, there were still 2 more acts of Natoma to go. Remember, opera was a big deal during this period, and this was also an era when American journalism was full of music critics. Every major American newspaper sent somebody to cover the event in Philadelphia, including the New York Times, the New York Evening World, and also the papers in Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, and even Omaha, Nebraska. Looking over them, I must say, this resulted in a lot of glowing reviews, much in the line of the Examiner that we just heard. But you know, I think it was kind of like that old story of the Emperor's clothes. Because although Victor Herbert's music in Natoma has really many lovely passages, as you can hear in the background here, but the libretto was really, well, not so great. Nobody wanted to say the truth, even though everyone was thinking it. Because, nowadays, the opera Natoma is famous not for being an amazing epoch in American opera history. It's famous for being one of the most famous failures in American opera history. Because, just like that fable of the Emperor's clothes, only one little boy spoke up, except in this case, the little boy worked for the New York Times, who wrote, "Natoma suffers from an amateurish libretto. It's written in a style of verse suggesting a mid-Victorian ballad that would bring a blush to a Broadway comic opera. Nor does the story that is unfolded in this libretto carry any strong conviction. Mr. Herbert is driven to gain local color in his music, but his musical style is apt to be rather spasmodic and explosive, except in his more anatomical and lyric passages." And though the New York Times praised the performance of Mary Garden, it allowed that all the French and Italian members of the cast struggled with the English words and failed to make themselves understood. Now, right below that scornful review in the Times, on the same page, was another story that recounted the piles of congratulatory telegrams that arrived in Philadelphia for Victor Herbert, including ones from his fellow opera composers Giacomo Puccini and Pietro Mascagni. All the principals and creative staff were deluged with bouquets and floral tributes, sniffed the Times, enough to stock a conservatory. Nonetheless, in the way these things go, that night in Philadelphia, everyone present felt the need to act as if Natoma was a great success. And after the show, well-wishers piled into the stars' dressing rooms backstage at the Broad Street Met, finding room somehow amidst those piles of floral tributes, everyone offering kisses and congratulations. But perhaps everybody really knew deep in their hearts that the evening had been a complete dud. But nobody was going to say anything until they got home, turned to their partner and said quietly, "Was it just me? Or was that awful?" And as the news of that initial New York Times review got around, other critics began sharpening their pencils to pan it too when it played next 3 days later in New York. And New York audiences, knowing what was coming, refused to accept what their much too enthusiastic yokel Philly cousins had just sent up the pike to them. Like many a tryout show that went over big in Philadelphia, when it reached the other Metropolitan Opera House, the one in New York, Natoma died. 40 years later, in his memoir called "And I Stood There with My Piccolo," the composer Meredith Willson, our old pal, who wasn't there that night, he would have been only 9 years old, but who later knew Victor Herbert quite well and probably got the story from him, described the scene when the opera was repeated in New York with a grand reception at the Friars Club to follow on February the 28th, 1911. Meredith writes, quote, "I imagine that after Hannibal crossed the Alps and went back to his hometown, the local Rotarians planned a royal welcome that must have been a dilly. And I've heard that Lindbergh was rather well received at Le Bourget Airport when he flew to Paris, but I'm sure that no one in history was ever received more enthusiastically than Victor Herbert was when he walked into the orchestra pit at the Metropolitan Opera House for the New York premiere of his American grand opera, Natoma. Oh, the lucky few thousands who were able to beg, steal, or forge tickets to the Metropolitan on that gala night. And of course, the plans for the reception after the undoubted triumph included every kind of caviar, pheasant, and dignitary under glass that could possibly be squeezed into the banquet room at the Friars Club on West 48th Street. The only thing that nobody reckoned with was that this Indian grand opera might turn out to be probably the biggest flop of all time. The disaster became apparent early in the first act, and by the intermission, all the people who were to attend the reception after the performance were clutching at their bosoms in agony, knowing they couldn't possibly go to this reception, and also knowing that they couldn't possibly not go. The critics left after the second act, which is customary on a lot of opening nights in New York, so that the reviews can make tomorrow's morning paper, which are usually being sold in the streets as you come out of the theater. The opera got worse, clear down to the last curtain, which finally fell like the hopes of the customers praying for a last-minute miracle. Off to the guillotine and rack went some 400 of New York's biggest celebrities to squirm and gulp and push the mushrooms around in the au jus and the lettuce around in the vinaigrette and their hearts around in their shoes and their mouths, dreading the moment when the toastmaster would have to hit the crystal with the sterling and start the speeches. What could he say? What could anybody say? The moment did come, and Chauncey Depew rose to his feet, and this is approximately what he said. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to pay tribute to our beloved Victor Herbert on the occasion of the premiere of his opera Natoma. I think it would be appropriate at this time," and he dug some clippings out of his pocket, "to read these reviews. The first one says, 'What happened last night in the Opera House was neither opera nor drama. It certainly was not related to music in any way.' Well, by now the guests were ready to be carried out, and everybody thought the strain had been too much for Mr. Depew and that he had no doubt blown his cork. Everybody froze in his chair as Mr. Depew blandly continued reading reviews. Well, this one says, 'The performance last night at the opera was disgraceful and should never have been allowed.' This one says, 'The composer of the new opera, the premiere of which we were unlucky enough to attend, may have talent for some things, but writing opera is quite obviously not one of them.' And after two more like that, Depew finally put the clippings back in his pocket, and looking out into the staring eyes of this horrified audience, said, 'Ladies and gentlemen, shortly before we sat down to this banquet, I visited the library here in the Friars Club and collected the clippings I've just read to you. They were actual reviews of the first performance of Bizet's opera Carmen. It would have taken the great Manitou himself to have saved Natoma, but Chauncey Depew's magic worked a miracle almost as great in saving Victor's face that fateful night." Thus the great raconteur and composer Meredith Willson. Well, Herbert's face may have been saved that night, but I bet that he was very despondent next morning when he got up and read the actual reviews, and they were very different than they had been from the Philadelphia performance. This time around, every single review of Natoma in the American papers, except for a few diehard friends of its creators, were scathing. Nevertheless, the Chicago-Philadelphia Opera Company put that piece in its regular repertoire and repeated it stubbornly for a few more years. But finally, Natoma was quietly shelved and mostly forgotten, except as the story of a false Philadelphia dawn of a famous New York failure. Our third story takes place on December 7th, 1948. That was the 7th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course. And it was also the night of a performance of Richard Wagner's Gotterdammerung at the Academy of Music. It was a great occasion because the New York Metropolitan Opera was returning to Philadelphia, the first time it had played the famous old venue in the Quaker City since the U.S. had entered World War II, exactly 7 years previously. Although this performance of Gotterdammerung was scheduled to be over 4 hours long, a capacity crowd of enthusiastic Wagnerians and Philadelphia opera-goers were in the audience. The Academy's lobbies were bustling with tuxedos and ball gowns. Some of the 2,500 attendees had paid between $11,000 and $12,000 just for the privilege of being there on the opening night. Many grand old names of Rittenhouse Square and the main line had pulled their old opera cloaks and top hats out of the closet for the first time since 1941. That was the traditional way to celebrate a night at the opera in Philadelphia, after all. The Met had been coming to the Academy of Music for 63 seasons, and the Philadelphia audience's sartorial display, arriving in cars and coaches, parading down Broad Street in ball gowns, that was part of the fun. In another tradition of long standing, other Philadelphians gathered on Broad Street just to watch the swells go by. Many music fans of the younger generation, however, tempered by the democratic experience of service and sacrifice during the Depression and the war years, dressed a little less ostentatiously. Those folks mostly just put on something nice and went to enjoy the opera. Still, as reporter Ronald Van Tyne wrote the next day in the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, there wasn't a diamond tiara in sight, and the cloakroom attendant, who had been checking opera capes, canes, and headgear for 20 years, stood guard over only a dozen silk toppers. "People just don't seem to dress the way they used to," she said. Old-timers called it a memorable opening, however, and seemed impressed by the splash of color in the gowns. Black and other somber shades gave way to white and gold, green and blue. The younger women went for off-the-shoulder creations. Outside the Academy, a gum-chewing girl in a well-worn trench coat and beret nudged her companion as one exquisitely gowned dowager swept majestically up the steps. "Well, you gotta admit it," she said. "Some of them look pretty nice." "Yeah," her friend agreed. "Did you notice? A lot of the old ones look better than the young ones." As the audience settled into their seats, the orchestra played Wagner's famous overture. Of course, some folks were still arriving fashionably late. As much as an hour after the curtain, the Met's manager, Edward Johnson, continued to patrol the marble lobby of the Academy, greeting latecomers. "It's a magnificent house and a magnificent audience," he insisted. "We're very happy to be back in Philadelphia." At about 10:25 p.m., in the middle of Act II, Lauritz Melchior and Helen Traubel were on stage as Siegfried and Brunhilde. Backstage, Blackie the horse waited for his cue. Blackie, a familiar old Philadelphia post office mail horse who regularly trotted around the streets of Center City in the early morning hours, had been recruited by the Met at the last minute to portray Grana, Brunhilde's trusty steed. But Blackie didn't seem to like all the fuss and noise and lights and balked at going out on stage. "Don't worry, Blackie was just nervous," said his handler defensively. "Ain't you ever been nervous?" he hissed at all the annoyed Academy stagehands. Then somebody smelled something burning, a definite odor of conflagration, and it wasn't even time yet for Siegfried's funeral pyre in the last act. A stir went through the Academy crowd. Some nervous people got up and left. Blackie, waiting for his entrance, began to shift nervously in the wings, but Traubel did not flinch and continued her aria. The conductor in the orchestra pit did not pause the glorious music. Dozens of distinguished patrons who thought they smelled smoke left their seats and hurried out to the lobby, reported Van Tyne. On stage, Brunhilde completely ignored the confusion and went on, denouncing Siegfried in one of the most dramatic scenes in the long opera. Her voice seemed to rise as if to drown out the whispers of excitement that boiled up from the parterre boxes to the amphitheater high above the orchestra pit. Harold Mason, the Academy of Music's manager, hurriedly escorted a squad of ushers, firemen, and stagehands on a cellar-to-garret search of the old hall. But he discovered that the only real smoke was in the lobby, coming from the cigarettes of audience members who had popped out for a break from all the Sturm and Drang in the auditorium. "We found nothing at all," said Mason, voicing the opinion that the uncertain, disturbing odor had come from freshly painted scenery baking in the glare of white-hot stage lights or from ventilating fans which had been known to allow lobby smoke into the theater. Only a handful of first-nighters went home, the Bolton reported. If they did so, they missed Blackie the male horse's entrance. which everyone else greeted with a round of affectionate applause. The majority of Philadelphians stayed on for Wagner's final act. Quoth the evening bulletin, all traces of nervousness had disappeared from both Blackie and the Philadelphia audience by the time Brunhilde plunged into Siegfried's roaring funeral pyre shortly before midnight. And so, with many sympathies for that sweet but nervous old male horse on the Academy Music stage, we'll wrap up this episode. It's been great fun spending 3 nights at the opera with you, though it's often been placed in a category different from that of the other dramatic arts, with artistic conventions and rules and economies of scale all its own. I think opera belongs firmly in the realm of theater history, and I will always strive to keep it there. I hope you too will soon be taking a chance to take in an evening of this great theatrical art form, wherever in the world you are listening to this podcast. Take care, and I'll be back again soon with another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.